It's exactly 1 year since my first business travel for BDO was cancelled as a result of COVID. And that trip was to have been to the ASEAN Finance Ministers meeting in Halong Bay near Hanoi, as Vietnam was chair of ASEAN for 2020. I'd researched a lot for that trip, and it's clear that Vietnam is an astonishingly exotic country with a unique heritage. It bears some similarities to Switzerland, if I might say so. I'm based here in Brussels, but Vietnam and Switzerland have a dynamic, industrious, hardworking people with big neighbors, if I could say that, who dominate and domineer in many respects. But both Vietnam and Switzerland are also very adept at handling those big neighbors, and many would say also at handling the US, the world's largest economy and superpower. And speaking of the US, another similarity is that the US Treasury Secretary, Steven Mnuchin, labeled both countries, Switzerland and Vietnam, as currency manipulators on the same day back in December, in the closing days of the Trump administration. So Vietnam and Switzerland share that as well. Vietnam is a land of both superlatives and contradictions. It has been rapidly industrializing and delivering GDP growth consistently for some years now. It's a darling of foreign investors. 90% of its adult population appear to be literate in English, which is not always the case in Southeast Asia. It has increased its soft power, according to the Lowy Institute in Australia, more than any other Southeast Asian country in 2020. It's the only ASEAN country on the UN Security Council. It's the only ASEAN country to show economic growth in 2020. And it was the first country which Japanese Prime Minister Suga visited when he was appointed late last year. So interesting. It's run by an avowedly communist administration, the Communist Party of Vietnam, but it has been pursuing an economically liberal path and market economy since as far back maybe as 1986, depending on how you assess it. It's also famously opaque and bureaucratic for foreign businesses and investors to navigate, but it has managed to chart a path between both the US and China, whose trade war has arguably benefited Vietnam more than any other country. So what do we in Europe really know about Vietnam? Well, to help us find out more, we're joined by three experts who really know Vietnam well. Two of our panel are actually Vietnamese, so they live outside the country. And our third is a Vietnamese expert who lives in the country, but is originally Australian. Lynn is an associate director in the Southeast Asia Business Intelligence Practice of Control Risks and is based in Singapore. She's also the lead analyst for Vietnam, where she helps clients navigate the dynamic country that offers enormous opportunities, but as I said earlier, is opaque and requires a detailed understanding of complex, changing political and economic environment. Before her current role, Lynn was a foreign correspondent for the Financial Times and Reuters, variously based in Hanoi, Jakarta, and London. So thanks for joining us, Lynn. Next is Dr. Hong Hiep, who is a senior fellow at the Vietnam Studies Program and the Regional Strategic and Political Studies Program of the Institute of Southeast Asia Studies, Yusof Ishak Institute, based in Singapore. Before joining ISEAS, Hiep worked for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Vietnam, and taught at the Faculty of International Relations, Vietnam National University in Ho Chi Minh City. Hiep's scholarly works and analysis have been widely published, and some of them are indeed mentioned in the invitation to today's event. And lastly, but not least, indeed, is Raymond Mallon. Ray is Australian, lives in Hanoi, and has worked for more than 3 decades, has more than 3 decades experience working on the economic development, regional integration, and sustainability issues across Asia and the Pacific. He has advised research, development, and planning agencies in Vietnam and throughout Asia on economic policy issues. And he also conducts periodic briefings for CEOs and board members of corporations on the opportunities and risks of investing in Vietnam and Southeast Asia. So thank you to our 3 panelists who indeed know Vietnam intimately. So we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts. I've given you the backdrop. Maybe the most immediate backdrop, of course, for everyone on today's webinar is the COVID story. So if I could turn to you initially, Ray, and ask you, Vietnam reacted very well and swiftly to the coronavirus outbreak almost a year ago now, shutting down its borders and still managing to produce very praiseworthy, noteworthy levels of GDP growth. So how were the different sectors affected by COVID, How will it change Vietnam? What is the lasting effect of COVID on the Vietnamese economy? Ray.
Yes, Vietnam's been incredibly fortunate compared with most of the other countries, and particularly given it was quite difficult in Vietnam being so close to China, the original source of the outbreak, and also that the economy depends so much on trade and foreign investment. But despite that, growth remained positive. The worst affected sectors, obviously, international tourism and the services that go with that, and the impacts on hospitality given the closures. The strategy was sort of multi-pronged, and it was a competent approach that the government adopted that limited the impact on domestic mobility by having very highly effective contract tracing systems in place. So overall, it's got through the problem very well. There has been a big boom in e-commerce and e-retailing, and that trend is likely to continue. The government has recommitted to pushing forward and accelerating the e-government, which I see as an important step forward for the future, but we have to wait to see how quickly that is actually done.
Very good, Ray. Hiep, from your vantage point in Singapore, how do you see how Vietnam has handled the COVID story over the last 12 months?
Yes, as Ray mentioned, tourism, hospitality are the most affected industries, but at the same time, we can see some impact on the retail industry. Some small businesses and casual workers are also affected. Many of them lose their jobs and have to go back to their home in the provinces. The good thing is that Vietnam has been able to contain the virus inside the country. So except for a lockdown period of about 1 month, after that, domestic travel was resumed and people started to go back to the shopping malls. But it was not as good as before the COVID-19 pandemic started. So that's why Vietnam registered a GDP growth of 2.9%, the only country in Southeast Asia to achieve a positive growth. This year, in the first quarter, they registered 4.5% growth, and they expect to achieve 6.5% to 7% growth rate this year. And I think whether Vietnam will be able to achieve that target will depend on how Vietnam will continue to contain the virus in the coming months. And the government has been talking about adopting the vaccine passport to open the countries to more business people and travelers. So hopefully, if Vietnam can continue its success story in containing the virus, the government will be able to achieve that growth target for this year.
Thanks, Hiep. And one of the other important background issues is the recent National Congress of the Communist Party of Vietnam, where I believe General Secretary Trong was re-elected. Linh, would you like to comment on the implications of that in terms of the politics of the country and what it will mean for economic policy in particular?
So talking about the party congress, we re-selected, or people say elected, but I could correct, selected the party chief, the 74 years old man Nguyen Phu Trọng, who's already in his position for 2 terms, which was 10 years. And they just broke the party constitution to allow him to rule for another term. Although there are some speculation that he might just retire after, in the middle of the term, so after 2 to 3 years. And appoint some successors after that. But for now, all we can see is they broke the party constitution and allow someone who already overreached to rule the party in the next term. What does that mean for the countries, and what does that mean for business? I think in general, Vietnam will still pursue the policy what Noel mentioned earlier, that on one hand ruled by one single communist party, but on the other hand apply quite a liberal economic policies, because the leaders, they understand that they need economic performance to boost their performance. At the end of the day, they need to have higher GDP, higher investment rate to prove that they rule the country successfully. What does this mean for foreign investment? I think although different leaders might mean they bring in their own business interests, their own cronies, a group of business companies, so that might, in the short term, affect the local companies, local business. But for foreign companies, I think they still pursue a very open, welcome attitude towards foreign investment, because foreign investment is very important for Vietnam at the end of the day.
Yeah. And would you agree with that, Hiep? Do you think it'll be continuity rather than change, at least as regards economic, the economic liberal approach?
Yes, I agree that there will be more continuity than change in terms of policy. So no matter who is in charge, I think Vietnam will continue to pursue economic reforms. One thing we should pay attention to is the target that the party set at the Congress. They set the target of turning Vietnam into an upper middle income country by 2030 and a high income developed economy by 2045. What does it mean? It means that with these ambitious goals, they have no choice but to pursue further economic reforms. If they don't pursue more reforms, it's almost impossible for them to achieve those targets. So I think looking at the targets, we can be assured that they will continue all the reforms they have been doing, and maybe they will introduce more reforms to facilitate the achievement of those ambitious goals.
And Ray, if I could ask you, one of the signature programs of the government in recent years has been anti-corruption drives. I think it goes by the rather colourful name of Blazing Furnace. Do you see that continuing under the new government?
Yes, I think very much so. Of course, one of the key factors that are going to be critical in reducing corruption are going to be reducing opportunities for corruption. So I think what you've seen over the last decade or two, a lot of work on administrative simplification of the regulatory environment, and going forward, this movement towards e-governance, the fact that now a lot of people are filing tax returns online, and many of the customs declarations are moving in that direction. All these sorts of things should help reduce corruption. It won't be just from the big profile cases that we hear, although those big profile cases do act as a deterrent. And I would think that I've noticed a degree of nervousness about making decisions. Sometimes that results in a slowing of decisions because they're worried about possible implications of the decision they made. They're being more careful. So I think that's all important. I think the other area is that the National Assembly is likely to include the land reform on the agenda in the next few years, and that has been a major source of corruption. So anything that they can do to streamline systems of land management, get greater transparency into land zoning and reclamation processes would have a big impact on the big corruption. Of course, the petty corruption is likely to be around for some time to come.
One of the highlights of my research was seeing where it stood on the ease of doing business index from the World Bank, and it's down around number 70 for last year. Do you see that improving in the next few years, Hiep, in terms of more efficiencies, digital acceleration, corruption, all of those kind of areas pushing Vietnam further up the league table in terms of ease of doing business, particularly for foreign investors?
Yes, I think so. One particular figure we should watch closely is Mr. Phạm Minh Chính, who is going to become the next Prime Minister of Vietnam. He has a track record of pursuing different reforms, administrative reforms, business environment reforms, although at the local level, but with the ambitious goals set for his term, I have no doubt that he will pursue these reforms to facilitate the economic development agenda. So I trust that with those reforms, Vietnam will be able to achieve higher goals in the coming years and continue to welcome foreign investors to help further facilitate economic development of the country.
Well, just drawing off your comment about foreign investors, what role does Vietnam play within ASEAN and regionally in terms of trade? It is a member of both RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and also TPP. As well as that, it has signed trade agreements with Europe, most recently also with the UK, and I believe with EFTA, including Switzerland in the near future. So Linh, over to you on that. Vietnam and trade, it seems to be a very open country, a very high percentage of trade to GDP. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. compared to other countries in ASEAN, Vietnam is the most open economy. And also, like, if you take in terms of the market size, Vietnam and Indonesia are two biggest markets in ASEAN. But look at Indonesia, the economy is basically rely on domestic consumption, while Vietnam economies, especially last year and this year, rely on exports and government spending. So the country is like totally open to international trade, and some trade paths, including those you mentioned, CPTPP, RCEP, and a few other bilateral FTAs, really boost the country economic performance during past few years. One thing I wanted to mention is that if you notice the economic growth figure of Vietnam last year and the first quarter of this year is rely heavily on export from FDI, foreign direct investment companies, which on one hand means that FDI companies can take the advantage of those FTAs better than local companies, but on the other hand also mean that they can adapt to the pandemic better than local companies. So it leaves a lot of opportunities for investment, but also raise the question on the stability of the economic performance of local companies. And the last point I wanted to mention is that in the first quarter of this year, the US is the biggest importer of Vietnam. And well, I think trade surplus to the US or to any other country is a good thing for Vietnam. But it's also very risky when the economies rely heavily on one single market, especially with that market Vietnam hasn't had an FTA with, not yet. So I think it's a very risky position for the countries in the longer term.
Ray, you have a lot of experience with regional trade issues. Do you think that the trade agreements that Vietnam has signed up to, some 17, have been a key element of their economic development in recent years?
Yes, very much so. I mean, one of the strategies right from the early stages of reform was to promote competition. And originally the competition came through foreign investment and trade, and that has stimulated innovation. They've been much slower in pushing forward in terms of state enterprise, or at least privatization, but at least they have the competition with the foreign investors and even between the state enterprises, and that has stimulated innovation. And I think the regional trade agreements have been all part of that, and it's also the Asian Economic Community have been important. And this has also facilitated Vietnam's greater engagement in regional production networks, and that's been important in terms of transfer of technology and providing access to new markets. In addition, for the people that are pushing for reform and actively promoting the reform agenda in Vietnam, having commitments under the agreements is another argument also to keep push forward with the reform agenda. So I think that's, you know, it has been really important. I think one of the problems in the past, which touches on what Linh was saying, they were probably a lot more nervous about the domestic private sector, certainly up until about 2000, when the enterprise law reform came. But it was only been since about 2015 that you see the domestic private sector growing at a faster rate than the foreign direct investment. And that was a very positive thing because, you know, that's good for sustainability, it's good for equity, all sorts of reasons. And certainly it looks like the COVID impact has been hardest on those domestic private enterprises, and they haven't grown as fast as the foreign investors in 2020. Hopefully there'll be a rebound from 2021 onwards.
Yep, had you any additional thoughts on what makes Vietnam such an attractive destination for foreign investment from Europe, from Australia, and I presume from the US as well?
Yeah, I think there are a few factors at work here. Vietnam is known as a young country with young demographics. The wage is still quite competitive compared to other countries, for example, China. So the labor cost is competitive, and other factors at work here as well. Vietnam is close to China, so as we can see during the trade war, many companies shift their part of their production facilities to Vietnam, partly because it's easier to do so than moving their facilities to other faraway countries. Vietnam is also improving its infrastructure. If you go to Hanoi and the surrounding area, you can see that the infrastructure is improving very fast. Vietnam also has a lot of FTAs, as you mentioned. So many investors want to take advantage of the FTAs to export to other countries. And Vietnam also offers many attractive incentives for investors in terms of tax, access to lands, etc. So these factors work together to create an edge for Vietnam in attracting FDIs in the region.
Yeah. Lynn, if I could turn back to you, in terms of foreign investment from European companies, Swiss companies, for example, into Vietnam, what are the main trends you're seeing? What sectors are they investing in? And what are the main risks and challenges they have been facing and will face going forward?
Sure. Sorry, before answering that question, I just wanted to add a very quick point. What makes Vietnam become like more attractive than other countries in the region? Also because a lot of things going on in other countries in Southeast Asia. Look at Myanmar at the moment, and look at Indonesia with the religion issue, Philippines with a very unpredictable leaders, and the same stories with other countries as well. So Vietnam with a very stable political conditions become a very promising and attractive markets for foreign investors. So to your question about the Swiss investment in Vietnam, I think FMCG is the #1 sector with a lot of Swiss companies in the country. And also Vietnamese consumers, they tend to prefer like the richer they get, as you can see, like Vietnam's middle incomes, like the fastest growing in the world during past 5 years. So the richer they get, the higher qualities products they prefer. And Switzerland is like one of the destinations where it's famous for high-end products that attracts a lot of consumers in Vietnam. Other sectors, including energies, especially in renewable energies and equipment in relating to renewable energy sectors, where the countries rely that it cannot rely on traditional form of energies like in the past. So the countries have been giving a lot of incentives and favorable policies towards investment in that sector, which attracts many investors in that as well. And one sector, which is still small, but I see it's very potential of growing in the next 10 years, which is in finance, banking and finance. As we know, like Swiss companies have very strong companies in that sector. But in Vietnam, we don't see like big presence of those banks and financial companies in Vietnam yet. And we see a rising demand from Vietnamese people, especially rich people, to engage with these companies in the near future.
With an eye to the BDO client base here in Europe, for example, a lot of mid-market clients and ambitious SMEs, how easy is it for European mid-market and SME businesses to do business and to invest in Vietnam? Ray, could I pose that question to you?
I think it's getting easier. I think when we look at the FDI figures, it's important to recognize that it's very open to FDI, but the bulk of that's coming from Asia. And at the moment, in particular, Korea dominates the foreign direct investment, and Samsung in particular. So, it is highly concentrated in Asia. So originally it was Singapore. Increasingly now it's Korea. But you also have China increasing. I think it's in 3rd place in the last 6 months or so. But the Europeans, America are relatively minor players compared with Asia. It's different when you get to trade. America dominates. It's something like 25%. I think Europe about 20%. But China's growing quickly and may have even overtaken Europe as well. In terms of imports, China is the most important market for Vietnam. It gets most of its imports that way. So it's going to be difficult. You're going to have to pick your niche markets. If you look at the foreign direct investment figures for the last 3 or 4 months, most of it's been coming for manufacturing. Just about all of it, something like half of it is going there. and then another 30% is coming into the utilities. And I think that's where the European companies have probably got a strong potential area in the area of power, and the shift to renewables is happening very, very quickly. ABB is a big player here. I think it's going to be in those areas that Europe, and then of course in trade itself, and services. And as Ling mentioned, the financial area is something that they're going to have to work, and maybe in specialized areas of training. I think there is a growing recognition that you have very good basic education in terms of what's provided at the primary level, but there's now a need for a really renewed focus on specialized skills on everything from hospitality to finance to basically business management or even factory management. So I think there's going to be opportunities in those areas.
Thanks, Ray. I'll just pause for a moment to remind the audience to, if you have any questions, to post them in the Q&A function. And I will get to those in about 10 minutes time. We should have about 20 minutes for questions with the panel. So if you have your questions ready to go, a good time to type them into the Q&A function right now. So back to the panel. Hiep, a question on China. China, of course, has the advantage over Europe as regards Vietnam of its proximity, at least from a business point of view. How big a factor has Belt and Road Initiative been for Vietnam? And what should European investors do to try and counter the advantage that Chinese competitors may have as regards investing and trading with Vietnam? So Belt and Road Initiative initially, and then what should European investors do to compete with Chinese competitors?
Vietnam is a developing country, so although Vietnam has been trying to develop its infrastructure, it still has a huge demand for more capital to invest into its infrastructure, especially in other regions outside the Red River Delta. So that's why Vietnam has been actively looking for fundings from different sources. And of course, the BRI can be seen as a potential source of funding for Vietnam's infrastructure project. But so far, Vietnam has been supportive, of the BRI and has made some statements to endorse the BRI. Vietnam has actually not very actively, pursued BRI projects. I think one of the concern is the security aspect of these loans because of the South China Sea dispute. Vietnam does not want to borrow from China because if it does, it may become beholden to China and cannot stand up against China in the South China Sea. And moreover, Vietnam has had some not very good experiences with China-funded infrastructure projects. If we go to Hanoi this day, you can see that the one metro line there, which has been built by China, is still delayed and after 10 years of construction. So it's a primary example of the downside of Chinese loans, Chinese infrastructure projects in Vietnam. So I think that's why Vietnam is turning to other investors. I think, for example, in the energy sector, Vietnam has been working with U.S. investors to build LNG-fired power plants. And I heard that some European investors, especially in the renewable energy sector, like offshore wind farms, for example, from Norway, from Denmark, they are also actively looking for opportunities to invest in Vietnam. So I think China may have some advantage, but there are still a lot of opportunities for other investors, partly because of Vietnam's rather cautious approach to Chinese money. Okay.
So one of the areas European and Swiss companies could look to is in the energy and renewables area in terms of specialist skills here in Europe.
Yes, of course. Energy is a big sector, but I think there are other sectors that European investor can look to, like in the manufacturing sector, automobile, high-tech manufacturing industries, even real estate and some finance and banking industry as well. I think Vietnam want to diversify its sources of investment, not to rely on only one single source of investment. I think that's the strategy that Vietnam is pursuing at the moment.
Yeah. Lynn, could I ask you if the EU FTA, the UK FTA, and I suppose the would-be EFTA FTA that's the EFTA free trade agreement with Vietnam, will and are leading to increased trade and investment between Europe, all of Europe, not just the EU, and Vietnam?
Yes, I mean, theoretically, people expected a lot from that free trade agreement, but unfortunately, the deal just happened before the pandemic. So we haven't seen like very strong or like long track record of how the impact of the deals on Vietnam in particular. But we see some positive indications like I mentioned earlier, Vietnam economy is like boosted mostly by export, and some of that is like thanks to the FTA with the EU and the UK and other countries. What we expect is like after the pandemics, when everything's open, then we see a lot more indication from that. Sorry, one point I wanted to add about the Vietnam-China relation and whether like opportunities for other investments is that actually I think there's a simple fact that in every single relationship, whether it's personal relationship or international relationship, sometimes you need a crisis when you feel like you're stuck in your way and you need to get like shaken up. And I think that the COVID-19 is the crisis that Vietnam needs to shaken up its relationship with China. Look at the COVID vaccine diplomacy from China. Vietnam is the only ASEAN country which hasn't accepted the vaccine from China yet. So I think that after the pandemic, the government's like rethinking of its balancing act between China and relationship with other countries.
Ray, when I was speaking to you last week in preparation for today, we discussed the recent announcement that Vietnam hopes to have a digital government by 2025. Maybe not on the same scale as Estonia here in Europe, but very digitally savvy population, and the government wants to digitize all government services. How realistic is that, and has COVID accelerated the digital transformation of the country?
Progress was already being made, and I think COVID is just one of those things that will accelerate the process. And so I think it's very, very likely to happen. Their target of getting all that done by 2025. Track record is usually you don't quite meet those. It can, some things will be done in advance, but other things will take a bit longer. There'll be a lot of vested interest because these sorts of things, wherever you have direct contact, are opportunities for corruption. So getting rid of them, putting it in e-government will reduce the opportunity for corruption, so there will be resistance to it. But in all these areas of administrative simplification, it goes back to your earlier question, which I didn't quite answer, is going to make it a lot easier for the smaller or medium-sized investors to come into this country. If you can cut down your overhead costs of getting started, your search costs, you simplify those fixed cost elements of getting approvals, etc. That's going to really provide new opportunities, I think, for the small and medium-sized enterprises. It'll probably also make it easier for some of the investors from countries where they're going to be companies are under greater scrutiny in terms of their corporate governance standards and greater resistance to any suggestion that corruption was being paid. Getting rid of these opportunities will make it easier. It won't solve the problem overnight, but it'll be a step in the direction.
Yeah. Yep, if I could turn to you, a lot of the people on today's webinar here in Europe and particularly in Switzerland will have a deep commitment to the environment, to nature, to green recovery. I wonder how much damage Vietnam is doing to its habitat, its environment, in terms of its rapid industrialization. Is it taking care to reindustrialize in a green way with the Paris Climate Accords in mind? What initiatives is it taking to go down the route of green energy as opposed to coal and other fossil fuels?
I think the Vietnamese government is acutely aware of the environmental problems, and actually Vietnam is one of the most vulnerable countries in terms of being impacted by climate change. So I think Vietnam has been taking a lot of measures to deal with this issue. As you mentioned, Vietnam is steering away from coal-fired power plants, and they are moving towards greener, more environmentally friendly sources of energy like solar, wind energy, and especially LNG fired power plants. So that's the big trend. Vietnam is also working on other sectors, to make the economy more sustainable. So they will not welcome investors who bring in, polluting technologies or outdated technologies. They will be more selective in accepting FDI projects. That's a good thing. And they also taking initiatives to reduce the carbon footprint. For example, now they are encouraging local companies to adopt new technologies to reduce fuel consumption, like VinFast, for example. That's one of the biggest private conglomerate in Vietnam. They are now trying to catch up with other competitors and develop their own electric vehicles. So that's the big trend. I think in the future, Vietnam will move further in that direction, and to make the economy more sustainable in the long term.
Okay, thanks. Yep. Last question before we turn to some really excellent questions coming from the audience. But last question to you, Linh, and if I could get a quick answer on the demographics and the skills and education challenges that Vietnam might face, particularly as it rapidly industrializes.
I think in terms of education, let's talk about that first, because I think it's the most important. Lots of people talking about Vietnam could be a replacement for like a China +1 destination for manufacturing company. Why on one hand, I agree with that. On the other hand, I think that the skilled labor force in Vietnam still cannot compare to China, not only because the small scale of the countries, but also Vietnam doesn't have enough skilled workers who can afford to make a lot of high sophisticated products compared to what they're doing in China. So education is key on that. And although the government's been focusing a lot on improving that, we see a lot of improvement in the countries. But if they don't take the opportunities fast enough, then I think they might lose it. In terms of demographics, Vietnam has very young, enthusiastic population. But on the other hand, we've been talking a lot about the countries might get old before they get rich. If the path of the development, economic growth doesn't grow fast enough, then we might see populations get old and lack of a labor workforce before they can reach the developed country status.
Thanks very much for that, Linh, and for the panel for taking all of my questions. We have a long list of questions from the audience. So I'm going to just throw them and ask you for quick, brief answers so that we can get through as many as possible. One that came in advance, in fact, is probably quite a specific one, but it has some interesting aspects to it. Ray, I might ask you to take this, and I'll just read it as it is. In the run-up to the party congress, it's common for major decisions regarding land approvals, property projects, or other large investments to be put on hold. Now that the party congress is complete and leadership confirmed, have you seen any major projects or large investments start to move forward that were previously paused?
Yeah, no, I haven't seen concrete examples of that, and that's certainly right that things do go on a hold. Key decisions can be hard to get made in the lead up to the Congress, so that premise is right. The problem, of course, is that COVID itself has had such a dramatic impact, and particularly in terms of investment in real estate and property development, those sorts of things where land is important. So there's just been a total drying up in overall foreign direct investment into real estate. Most of it, as I said before, is just now going into manufacturing and into utilities, and particularly energy. Probably too early to say.
Okay.
The other issue related to it a little bit is that the issue of land management and the land law will be likely be under debate for the next couple of years. Hopefully that won't slow things down too much.
Okay, I'm going to abuse my moderator's position from BDO and just take a question from my regional CEO, Stephen Darley, who has posed a question about the language proficiency. And Hiep, maybe you might respond to this. I mentioned that Vietnam has 90% English language proficiency, at least in its over 15s. That puts it well ahead of many of its neighbours and on a par with Singapore, Malaysia, Philippines. So quite an advantage in the world we live in. particularly in comparison to Thailand. So how or what measures in the reforms are likely to take advantage of this? And is Vietnam likely to rise as a place for offshoring and training, etc.?
Thank you. I think Vietnam is trying very hard to improve the level of English proficiency, especially among the young people. But I think the number is not that high yet. Of course, more and more young people are speaking English, but mainly in the cities, in the rural areas, for example, most of them are still not up to the standard. But anyway, I think the Vietnamese government is well aware of the importance of English education, and so that's why they are trying to reform the curriculum so that the students can have a better command of English. And it should be noted that apart from English, Vietnam is also trying to introduce more languages, to the local students. Recently, they introduced German and Korean as well, because from the government's perspective, these are important investors in the country. And if the young people can speak these languages, they will have more job opportunities. So I think this is a good way for the country to develop the workforce. But overall, I think English remains the most important language. So I think the government will continue to invest more in English education.
Okay, thanks, Hiep. Interesting that German is on the list. I guess that helps Switzerland, though it's probably not Swiss German that they're learning in Hanoi these days. I'm just going to take a question from the top of the table, as it were, in the Q&A. Lynn, maybe you might take this one for me. How will the South China Sea conflict affect Vietnam's economic goals and policies in the near future? Do you think Vietnam will be ready to make concessions concerning its national interest to China or any other conflict parties for the sake of better economic ties? And I suppose that speaks to one or two of the other questions as well about maintaining good relations with its big northern neighbor.
As I mentioned earlier, I think the COVID-19 is the event where the government's thinking about rebalancing between the relationship with China and other countries, especially with the US. But this year is quite unpredictable in terms of Vietnam policy towards China for a couple of reasons. Number one, Vietnam just has a new government. Although we know briefly about their track records, but it's very unpredictable to see what's their policy toward China in the next 5 years. On the other hand, we also see that China also just had their party congress, and it indicates that they might be more aggressive on the South China Sea issue in the next couple of years. Like just 2 weeks before the Vietnam Party Congress, China announced that it will allow fire towards any international any foreign vessels around the disputed waters. That means like a strong message from Beijing to Hanoi that we're not going to let you have easy year or like next couple of years. So I think from both sides, it's going to be very difficult position for two countries and unpredictable as well. But on the other hand, we haven't mentioned the elephant in the room here, which is the US, also another superpower, and what's their position in this relationship Vietnam-China with the Biden administration. I think that, of course, he's wanted to pursue the Asian pivots and pursue Obama's policy towards a stronger influence in Southeast Asia, including Vietnam. But on the other hand, I think Biden's administration also gonna pursue the human rights issues like a lot more aggressively than Trump's administration, which will put it in a more challenging, so difficult position, because Vietnam government doesn't want to talk about that topic, or they doesn't want to follow international value on that. So it's also make it more difficult to the US to like check the Chinese influence in Vietnam.
Yep, could I kind of fuse two of the questions I see in from the audience and put these to you. It's how likely is a political awakening among the broader Vietnamese youth? Will they continue to put more importance on a successful and healthy economy rather than political freedoms? And then adding to that, how likely is Vietnam to achieve its ambitious economic goals without converting its political system to a liberal democracy? So I think they're all in around the same space. Over to you.
Thank you. These are very, important and also very difficult questions to answer. I think for most Vietnamese, not just the youth, the priority now is still to improve their economic well-being, and they see, political stability as the most important factor, which can facilitate continuous economic growth. So I think from my perspective, not many Vietnamese young people are keen to pursue, political changes if such changes may affect their, future job prospects or their ability to achieve, a successful career, for example. I think this mindset is applicable to the whole population, not just the young people. On the second question, whether Vietnam can achieve its ambitious economic goals without transforming its political system, I think this quite a big issue. We cannot actually, if we look at other countries in the world, there's no no strong correlation between the political system and the level of economic development. If we look at China, they are still doing very well economically without liberalizing the political system. So I think the Vietnamese government may be aware of this, and they will focus more on liberalizing the economy and develop the economy to provide a better life or living standards for the population. And as long as the people are getting better off, they have job opportunities, they can send the kids to school, the people will not complain about the government, and the party will be able to maintain its rule. So this is the logics in Vietnam at the moment, and they are not talking about radical political changes yet.
Thanks for that very clear answer, Hiep. If I could just move back to the more business and investment-oriented questions. Again, Ray, maybe I might ask you to take this one. Vietnam has a long track history of openness to FDI-driven manufacturing. That's foreign direct investment for everyone's benefit. But what about the tech sector? Will we see economic policies that support further engagement from foreign technology players, or more of a technology Brexit, which has been advocated by MOIC? I'm sorry that I don't know who MOIC are, but I'm sure you do, from time to time. And what can we expect of actual implementation of the cyber law? So, Ray, does that make sense to you, that question?
Yes, I can see where that's coming from. Yeah, there was some restrictions put in place in terms of where data is stored, etc., which was seen as a disincentive for Facebook and Google investing in Vietnam. But I think overall the focus on IT is very high, and this Industry 4.0 has been a big feature of the new socio-economic development plan to 2030. It's going to be a big part of what policies are in place. The government has come up with a new strategy to try and attract investment in that area. But I guess you will have ongoing debates, particularly given the potential of or sensitivity of information in some cases. The rapid growth of social media in Vietnam has been very important, I think, it's been another tool, if you like, for reducing corruption and abuse of power by various sorts. If you see cops misbehaving these times, videos appear on social media, and it is something that is putting a limit on it. So there is a sensitivity in that sense of how far social media is used. Does it become engaged in political activation, for instance? So there is that, but there is no doubt, I think, that the pragmatists will win out. There'll be safeguards in place, but there's a very, very strong focus on getting foreign investment and providing concessions for foreign investment in high tech, on IT, all those areas.
Okay, Hiep, I see you wanted to comment on that as well.
Yeah, I just want to add some insights on this issue. I think for the cyber security law, I understand that there are some concerns among investors that the Vietnamese government may restrict investment into this IT sector. But my understanding is that they want to have the law in place to deal with contingencies in the future when they have to deal with security issues. But overall, I think they are still very open to foreign investment in general, and foreign investment in the IT sector or manufacturing, high-tech manufacturing sector in particular. I can give one example. Last year, there was some debate about whether the government should impose a foreign ownership limit of 49% on certain, technology sector, including the fintech sector, in particular the payment intermediary service companies, for example. But in the end, they decided not to impose the foreign ownership limit on those companies. I think that's one of the indications that the government is well aware of the importance of foreign capital in promoting, IT and also innovations inside the country. And because they set very ambitious goals for the country in the next 10 and 25 years, without innovations, without investment into the high-tech sector, in IT industry, for example, they will not be able to achieve those goals. So I think we can be assured that they will continue to welcome investments into those sectors.
Okay, thanks, Hiep. A question for you, Ray, and again, drawing on a number of the questions from the audience. In terms of infrastructure investment, has sufficient investment gone into the infrastructure to support the growth of the economy? The example given is the high-speed rail, or capacity rail and road links from Hanoi to Saigon, which don't seem to have moved forward that much. So basically, infrastructure overall, and in particular, maybe road and rail links. How are they going?
No, I mean, it's a challenge keeping up with the rapid growth rate. On the other hand, government expenditure as a percentage of GDP in Vietnam is, around the 26-27% mark. So it's relatively high, and a lot of that is going into investment. So, sure, infrastructure is constraining investment. There are bottlenecks. There's bottlenecks in ports and in some areas of roads. And there's probably growing domestic pressure on the environment issue, which requires increased investment in terms of improving urban infrastructure for mass transit, these sorts of things. And he had mentioned before the slow pace of doing some of these urban metro lines, I think, is far more important than the slow pace of the high-speed rail link between Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh cities. That proposal went to the National Assembly, and it was a very, very expensive project. It was going to take up a large percentage of total investment, and the National Assembly blocked it. It's come up again a couple of times, and no doubt one day it'll happen. But I think the concern was that it would just absorb too much of the limited amount of investment, public investment resources available. So the other area that they're going to have to move on is probably trying to look for areas where you can get private investment to replace public investment. A lot of donors push the PPP model, but I'm skeptical. It struggles to work effectively even in developed countries where there are strong institutions, and you still don't have the very strong regulatory institutions that can help PPP models work. It could happen here, but there's areas where it will work, and you can see in the areas of energy supply, when they got the incentives right, there was a lot of private investment come into renewable energies, into solar, even household systems. Airports is another area where it's relatively easy to attract foreign direct investment. The challenge, of course, when you do that is make sure you get the regulatory environment right, so you still get competition. You don't want airlines coming in and getting monopoly power through airports. Same thing with seaports. So okay. there is going to be increased opportunities to get private investment in there, but it's going to have to be managed properly, and that'll have to be the way to go. There's a limit to how far the government can increase investment with its budget.
Thanks, Ray. We're coming to the top of the hour. I just want to get one last question in, not least because the word accounting is in it, and I'm an accountant. And I'm going to put it to Lynn, but I do need a quick answer, Lynn, so we can finish more or less on time. The question reads, regulatory development in banking, stock market and accounting practices remain critical to future growth. Is the panel satisfied that Vietnam can make progress in these areas? Lynn, if you could take that quickly for me, thanks.
The short answer is no in the short term, not this year. But I'm quite optimistic in the next 5 years because Vietnam is having quite capable candidates for the cabinet's next 5 years. Many of them are very well trained technocrats who understand the international financial market very well. So I'm quite optimistic that they're going to apply a lot of international standard in improving in those financial markets and other policies relating to the market as well. But yeah, short answer is don't expect too much this year.
Okay, well, I did hear you say the word optimistic a few sentences ago, so I'd rather close it with the word optimistic. We'll close it there anyway. I want to thank Asia Society for putting this event together today and for allowing me to moderate it. I want to thank our fantastic panel, real experts on Vietnam, and thanks for your answers and allowing me to rush you along and chivvy you along to keep it moving. I want to thank my colleagues at BDO, many of whom were on the line, who assisted me in preparing for today. And lastly, and most importantly, I want to thank the audience. We had almost 100 people on at one stage, and I hope we leave you better informed and have whetted your appetite for and about this really fascinating country.